I set up a camera to record my pet lizard, and I caught something horrifying instead. Written by LegOfZeg.
Before I get fully into this, I feel it necessary to point out that I have no idea how long this has been happening. But now that I know of it, now that I am fully and intimately aware of what I've been living with in blissful ignorance for an untellable amount of time, I absolutely cannot stop myself from hyperfixating on it. Like an old freckle that I've probably had my whole life, but upon discovery, my brain refuses to believe it could be anything other than cancer. Maybe it's harmless, but maybe it isn't. A week or so ago, I noticed that my pet lizard's tank decor, fake plants and general clutter, was consistently being overturned each night. Every morning, I would have to remove her from the enclosure and reorient most of her surroundings. I've had the lizard for a few years, and this was new behavior. Even so, it likely wouldn't have even struck me as odd if I had caught her doing it once or twice. I'm a night owl, so I almost never fall asleep before 3 or 4 a.m. But being that I had never bore witness to her antics, on top of the fact that she's a fairly small lizard, a leopard gecko, and some of her clutter is reasonably heavy, last night I finally decided to investigate further and see what sort of reptilian acrobatics my girl was getting up to in the wee hours of the morning. Now, my phone battery is utter garbage, but there was another solution. My mom's old digital camera. I say old, but I guess a more fitting term would be outdated, considering the prominence and availability of instant HD photo technology present in today's smartphones. Despite this, the camera is actually a pretty decent little gadget. Rechargeable battery, waterproof, and, most importantly, night mode. It took some effort to dig it out of the basement crawl space and recharge the battery, but by nightfall, I was ready to record Cirque de Lizard. I really wish I hadn't. I didn't bother setting up the camera until right before I was ready for bed, about 1:15 a.m. Early for me, yes, but I wanted to be able to wake up at a decent hour to view the footage. Fully charged, the battery would give me about 5 hours of continuous recording. Good. I switched it to night mode, long pressed the capture button to begin, and checked to make sure that the camera was recording clear video after turning off the lights. The tank is positioned in the middle of a dresser, with the tall backboard behind it, which within a large mirror is set. You know the type. Every suburban white mom has one in each bathroom. I placed the camera at an angle, more toward the corner of the tank so that I could capture two views simultaneously, a standard, more head-on perspective, and that from behind the tank, reflected in the mirror. Satisfied with my innovation, I went to bed. The tiny red light next to the record button, blinking twofold between reality and the mirror, promised a good laugh at the footage to be seen the following day. That brings us to this morning. I woke up earlier than usual, around 10 a.m. I had sort of hoped that the camera would still be functional, but it was as dead gets. As eager as I was to see what it was I'd capture, the 5 minutes it took to extract the SD card and boot up my laptop felt like straight up water torture. The video was 5 hours, 47 minutes, and 13 seconds long. At approximately the 1 hour mark, my gecko appeared from underneath her little log hide and rooted around in her bedding for a while, probably looking for stray crickets, since it wasn't a feeding night. After about 10 minutes, she returned to her log, where she stayed. I skipped ahead in the video, 15 seconds at a time, waiting for her to come back out. She didn't. For the first time since waking up, I thought to actually look inside her tank. Not a bug out of place. None of her plants were upturned. None of the decorative statues or hides shifted, or flipped, or knocked over. I felt a twinge of disappointment in my gut, and signed. Of course, she would stop her antics the second I decided to look into them. I returned to my bed, and made sure to close out the video. But something stopped me. I still had nearly 5 hours of unseen footage to go through. So, for no particular reason, I began to click through it, dragging the scrub bar and watching the frames zoom by. I stopped again at the 3.5 hour point, roughly 4:30 in the morning, when the thought occurred to me to listen for my own sleep talk. I'm somewhat famous in my family for holding full nocturnal conversations. Yeah. So, my newfound hope was that I'd at least capture some sort of mid-slumber rambling to laugh about later. 30 seconds of quiet, distant breathing, a little snore or two. That was all the normalcy afforded to me before the remaining contents of that video shook me to my very core. At exactly 3:33, the familiar creak of my bedroom door made me look up from my laptop, only to realize that the sound was coming from the video itself. The camera was not positioned to capture the door in its view, but it did anyway, via the mirror. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. From the crack in the door, barely wide enough to accommodate a mouse, and sulking this thing. Tall, staggeringly so, enough that it had to duck its head to fit through the door frame. Thin and sickeningly lanky. Black, spindly arms hung from sharply jutting, dislocated shoulders, far past where a normal human being's would have ended, practically dragging on the floor. Its knees, just as thin and just as dark, bent backwards like those of some sort of grotesque bird, silent and fluid, where they looked as though they should have cracked and snapped with each awkward lurching movement. It stepped like a shadow, impossibly quiet, unnaturally still between steps. The only audible sign of its presence was the creak and click of the door closing behind it, when again it turned, surveying the room, its unholy white eyes, pinpricks of light, gleaming in an otherwise deep-set void of a face, reflected in the mirror. As I watched this absolute nightmare of a thing, this manifestation of darkness on my laptop screen, I felt a strange air of familiarity wash over me. A part of my brain, the part accustomed to making jokes of everything as a form of macabre coping mechanism, laughed and pointed out that this must be my sleeping paralysis demon. Except that sleep paralysis demons only manifested when sleep paralysis did, not in the waking world, caught by mere happenstance on a digital recording. It hurt to breathe. It felt like this unholy creature's thin, branch-like fingers were pushing through my chest. Claws of shadows winding themselves dangerously tight around my lungs. I wanted, more than anything, to close out of the video and pretend I'd never seen it. But, foolishly, I carried on, driven by horror and curiosity and an innate desperation to wake from whatever nightmare had begun with the opening of that video file. The twitching, shuddering shadow figure made its way, slowly and methodically, across the room, limbs dragging carpet, too large head lolling to the side on a thin neck barely substantial enough to support it. Those pinprick eyes, white and soulless, were focused, unblinking, on my sleeping form. I felt a rush of bile surge its way up my windpipe as I watched it crawl into bed with me. The claws around my lungs tightened as it slunk into my only place of refuge, atop the covers, and settled next to my prone, helpless body. The second it draped one of those sickeningly long, shadowy limbs over my waist, and those hypnotic, malevolent eyes blinked shut into darkness, I exited out of the video. My hands were shaking like leaves in a violent spring storm. On autopilot, I dragged the video file from the SD card to the recycle bin, then manually clicked into the bin to delete the evidence of the previous night's horrors for good. I slammed my laptop shut with a finality that I wish my brain would take the hint and adopt as its own. I haven't recharged the camera. I haven't even replaced the SD card. But I'm going to. Why? I don't know exactly. Those grotesque limbs and shining white voids keep playing over and over in my head, frame by frame. The video is gone, but I'll never be able to unsee it. I'll never be able to unlearn of the eldritch horror that placed itself beside me in bed like it had slept there for 1,000 nights, and then some. Nor will I even be able to unwonder whether or not it will return, tonight or any night following. I woke up this morning, and have done so every other morning thus far. That has to count for something, doesn't it? It hasn't hurt me yet. Maybe it never will. Maybe that freckle is just a freckle. Maybe there's nothing to be afraid of, unless I think about it too hard. But maybe not. Tonight I'll replace the camera. I'm too afraid to record this thing head on, so I'll be using the mirror again. I just hope that I can handle watching whatever I capture. Update. Before I get into this update, I'll address some things from the comments of the last post. 1. No, I will not be uploading any footage. My reasoning will become apparent in a while. Regarding the original video, as stated previously, it was deleted from both the SD card and my PC immediately following the first viewing. Considering today's development, such is likely for the best. 2. Regarding suggestions that this entity may be some deceptively grotesque manifestation of a guardian angel, I very much doubt it. Again, my logic will become apparent. 3. Regarding those whose primary question is what on earth is taking place in my gecko's terrarium at night, my best guess is that she is either becoming distressed by the foreign presence, or she doesn't care at all and is simply a fan of extreme redecorating. My gut favors the first as the most likely, but unfortunately, I have minimal information to give in that regard. Okay, now, on to the main update. I wound up not sleeping in my own home the evening of the day I originally posted. This had nothing to do with the entity, but rather the fact that a good friend of mine invited me over to his place to hang out, and the sheer mundaneness of movies and pizza was a welcome distraction from the previous night's events. I wound up crashing at his place and didn't make it home until yesterday afternoon, hence the gap between the original post and this update. I did chat with my friend about weird dreams, childish fears, and the ever-mimetic concept of sleep paralysis demons, but did not outright disclose to him my current plight. I found that attempting to speak of my experiences out loud, as opposed to writing about them as I currently am, was capable of granting them some sort of power over me, as though making them too real. Say what you will about denial, but it does wonders for maintaining one's sanity when reality is more unsettling than any horror film fueled nightmare could ever prove to be. Immediately after returning home yesterday afternoon, I made sure that the camera was charging. I had plugged it in before leaving home, but wanted to be absolutely certain it would have enough juice to record come bedtime. I spent a good few hours after that attempting to research the creature I had captured on the video, primarily guided by all of your suggestions in the comments, but came up relatively empty-handed. I am not especially religious, but a fairly prominent part of me was comforted by the multiple suggestions that the cuddle demon, as it was referred to, could have been some form of protector. Having said this, recent developments notwithstanding, I am still not entirely comfortable with the idea of welcoming any sort of cryptid or supernatural being into my bed, regardless of its origins or intentions. Having gone about my usual bedtime routine, I finished off the evening by retrieving the camera and setting it up in the exact same place as before, facing the gecko's tank but angled towards the mirror, in a way that captured the reflection of both my bedroom door and the whole of my bed in the viewfinder. I wanted to replicate the previous video's conditions as perfectly as I could, as a method of control for this unholy little experiment, with one single exception. This time, I locked my door. It took me a great deal of time and effort to actually fall asleep. Knowing what I knew, there was a fair amount of tossing and turning, blanket kicking, and repositioning before exhaustion finally overtook me an hour or so later. As I'm sure you can tell by this post, I woke up this morning. A good sign for sure. I did, however, find myself instantly nauseous the second my eyes opened, and the full weight of what I was about to see settled over me like a curtain of dread. Had the locked door kept the creature at bay? Had it even shown up? A part of my brain was still hell-bent on refusing to acknowledge the proof of my eyes, and was convinced that I had imagined the entirety of the first video's content. After all, having deleted it, there was no longer any way to confirm or dispute the happenings therein. I was still fighting a somewhat overpowering gag reflex as I extracted the SD card and waited for my laptop to load its files, praying that the gravity of the situation would push down the bile in my throat, the same way it was weighing down my shoulders. The new video was shorter than the first, just over 4 hours. I wonder if leaving the camera plugged in for nearly 2 days had damaged the battery, and mentally kicked myself for being so careless. Still, 4 hours was 4 hours. As I clicked into the file, I swore to myself that I would go through the full length of it, rather than panicking and destroying the evidence as I had before. After all, failing to view the original video in full had left me with more questions than I cared to leave unanswered. How long had it stayed? How had it left? And perhaps more importantly, what the hell had it done to me, if anything, while I slept? I wanted to know the answer to the last question just as much as I didn't want to know. Funny how that works. The first hour of recording was nothing more than watching myself flail around sleeplessly beneath my covers, complemented by a few muffled swears of frustration. When my body finally stilled, at what I estimate was around 3:45 a.m., I leaned in towards the screen to wait. Within 15 minutes, my gecko emerged from her hide to hunt the crickets I had dumped into her tank before bed. The sounds of rustling, an occasional stridulating chirp, and the intermittent crunch of crickets meeting their demise were innocuous, normal, as were my quiet, more distant snores. What wasn't quite so ordinary was the sudden rattle of my doorknob. Gentle at first, but rapidly approaching violence as whatever was on the other side grew frustrated and shook the door furiously within its frame. Goosebumps pricked my skin, every hair standing on end. The rough and rage rattling rose to a crescendo, startling my gecko so badly that she did, in fact, flip over a decorative plant in her desperation to return to hiding. No sooner had she disappeared than the assault on the door abruptly stopped and plunged the room into an eerie stillness. Silence. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. My hand hovered cautiously over the mouse pad, ready to begin skipping ahead or to check if the video had, by chance, frozen. The second my finger touched the pad, my entire body shifted as though paralyzed by a sudden forceful burst of electricity. It punched the air from my lungs, leaving me in a state of breathless terror that gripped me relentlessly as the video progressed. The limited visibility of the mirror's angle had kept me from seeing the hand. Slow and rickety, but full of intent. A spindly claw of darkness snaked its way up from the space beneath my door, like a venomous serpent, fashioned from the shadows of hell's blackest corner. The hand reared up in search of its hindrance, the lock. Twitching fingers, too long to be properly functional, fumbled clumsily at the turning lock, errant in its efforts until sheer malevolent persistence yielded a twist and a heart-stopping click. For a moment, fear of what was to come rendered me dizzy, and I paused the video through my newly formed tunnel vision. I was alive, and as far as I knew, I was unharmed. Whatever happened next, it was in the past. It didn't change the fact that I, now, presently, was fine. It took a full few minutes of repeating these silent reassurances to myself before I calmed down enough to continue. Curiosity really will be the downfall of humankind. The inevitability of it is staggering, but even those aware of it have no power to resist its charms. The next few moments of the recording were identical to the happenings of the original video, on limbs too thin and too long to logically support its weight. The creature lurched inelegantly into my room. I could see its joints twitching, dislocating, and bending at unnatural angles with every sinister step. The sound should have been horrible. The snapping and grinding of bone on bone, and the organic creak of abused cartilage. But the entity was entirely silent, shuddering steps bringing it closer and closer to my sleeping form without a single sound to alert me to its presence. All the while, those shrunken, pinprick white eyes, glowing with unholy light, were fixed resolutely on me. Another wave of nausea surged its way up from within me as I watched the thing heave its gangly form up and over the raised lip of the bed's wooden baseboard. Heart hammering away where it had lodged itself in my throat, I watched as the monstrous shadow creature loomed over me, a blackened spider, poised to strike, beady eyes unwavering as they stared me down. The frame went still. I stared at the screen, at my dim, horrified reflection staring back at me for several full minutes before realizing the clip must be stuck. Dragging the cursor down to the scrub bar, I saw in my reflection the exact moment that it dawned on me. The clip was still rolling. Panic rising in my chest, I clicked on the scrub bar, jumping ahead by roughly 15 minutes. Then another 15. The image on the screen remained the same, save a slightly shift in my sleeping position. The monster remained where it crouched, limbs bent upward and claws buried in the sheets, over me like a predator, and I, its prey. It stayed like that for over an hour, not quite frozen, but shuddering and twitching as it watched me, as though doing so gave it some sort of sick, wretched gratification. At what I guessed to be around 5:30 a.m., it finally moved. It settled into the bed beside me as it had the previous night, draped one too long shadow talon hand over my waist. This time, however, it did not close its eyes. It took me a moment to realize, however, that it was no longer looking at me. The entity's gaze was locked, unshifting, unblinking, on itself, on the mirror, on the camera. Once again, the frame appeared to go still. This time I knew better than to assume it frozen. For the remainder of the recording's duration, the creature stared soullessly into that mirror. It never looked away, not even for a second. Those beady, shiny specks of white set into that grotesque void of a face never once tore themselves away from their focal point. The camera died just as the first rays of dawn slanted through the blinds across the room. The creature still in my bed. Having been unable to see it leave, I felt a shudder run the length of my spine as icy tendrils of dread wove their way into my veins. The damn thing may as well have still been next to me. When I turned my head, I half expected to be met with that malicious gaze. Unhallowed halos of light in a sea of impenetrable darkness. I didn't keep the video this time either. I know that deleting something from one's computer doesn't get rid of it entirely, but I'm not tech savvy enough to retrieve it, nor do I wish to. I've reason to believe that the thing's behavior is indicative of it having caught on to being monitored, and by the way it stared at itself, at the placement of the camera, for what may very well have been hours on end, I do not feel it wise to underestimate its displeasure. Not only that, but in terms of the video itself, I've simply no inclination towards showing it to anyone else, of potentially subjecting an innocent to the horrors I am living night after night. I have a feeling that they couldn't help me if I did. I hate myself. It may sound harsh, but it's true. I hate the obsessive mind that I was born with, that which is incapable of letting something go until a satisfactory amount of information has been obtained. I hate the hyperfixation, the fact that I will not be able to focus on something, anything else until I capture enough proof of this entity being harmless, despite the terror it carries with it, into my room each night. And for that to happen, I need to see it leave without harming me. I need to know how this ends. I'm going to start with replacing the camera battery.